Cool. Okay. So first, I always like to ask for if this is anyone's first time attending an Open GovHub event, if you can raise your hand in person or on Zoom. Okay, pretty good number here. So welcome again. Open GovHub was started in 2012, and we are a meeting place, which brings together folks with a common mission around helping open up governments to be more accountable and responsive to the people, and really promoting civic engagement in many different ways around the world. And the way that we support that mission is really through two core activities. We help folks to share essential resources to work more efficiently. And that includes our world-class co-working space here in DC, but also professional support services for things like event planning and IT and hiring and the things that every organization needs to work on. And the second core area of focus for us are our programs and events, to really create an environment where people can constantly meet someone new who can support their work and learn something new to be more effective. So we really know that all of the social change issues we're interested in are far too big and complex for any of us to solve alone. So we're here to cultivate that environment of sharing resources and joint work. And again, this is indeed our first hybrid public event since the pandemic started 1.5 years ago. And it's also our first hybrid event here in our new space, which we expanded into during COVID, after we had many years of high demand in our previous location. So it's a really special day. Happy to have you all here. Just quickly, I think to set the stage a little bit, I think our goal for today in learning about this incredible book, Letting Go, is really to hear the call to action for more participatory approaches to decision making, especially in philanthropy and the public and the social sector, as well as in the public sector. And this really echoes a lot of conversations we've had over the last few years in a really unique way. First and foremost, it just underscores the reality that many of us know deep in our bones, which is that individuals and local communities are the best experts at solving their own problems. So by handing back kind of the power and authority to set the agenda, we will all be more effective at solving these local and global issues. You know, we're always trying to kind of identify connections between different conversations that are happening, which are relevant and related to each other. So just a snippet of some of the previous conversations we've had, which are relevant to today's conversation and this builds upon, are, you know, the book talk that we had last year about winner takes all, talking about the influence of elites in the social sector, various system change conversations that we've had, definitely open budgeting and participatory budgeting conversations, decolonizing international development, looking at civic tech and kind of ways to support democracy through useful technology. So all of these are different connections that might come out of our conversation today. So finally, I'm really excited to introduce our speakers. So we have Meg Massey, who's the co-author of Letting Go. We were also expecting Ben, her co-author, to join us, but he's come down with a fever, so we wish him the best. And we're glad he's not in the room just for health and safety.
And he got a negative COVID test.
Yeah.
So just to clear the air with that COVID. He was still getting other things.
Yes, exactly. So, but Meg is a journalist who's been covering social impact and justice issues in the world of finance, who's been published in a variety of different outlets, and began her career in the Obama White House. Today's moderator is Gary Johnson, who I'm going to hand it over to now. I think Gary mentioned a little bit, but he's an award-winning startup founder and ecosystem builder who's been recognized in a number of different youth entrepreneurship avenues and platforms, and is the founder and executive director of First Founders, which is a 501c3 working to lower barriers to entry and increase the likelihood of success of entrepreneurs in the innovation ecosystem. So I think I will stop talking here. Very excited to hand it over to you, Gary, and jump into our conversation. And again, those of you on Zoom, feel free to share comments and introductions in the chat. And we will spend the last portion of our event here also doing a discussion in the room. So take it away. Thank you so much, Gary.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you to everybody who's participating in this event, and to everybody who's making it a success. I'm super excited, Meg, because you have this awesome book that we want to learn all about. And just so everyone knows, you know, we want this to be and engaging dialogue as well. So as you have questions as we go along, feel free to raise your hand. Virtually, if you have questions, those will be coming through for us to share with the group here in person too. So Meg, hello.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm great.
Awesome.
Barely made it here thanks to a Lyft canceling on me at the last second, but I'm here. So that is an example of technology, maybe trying to solve a problem and then having a little
That
flip
is
in the
okay.
system.
You are here now, so that's all that
Yep.
matters. Well, awesome. So Meg, if you could give us a brief background about yourself and then tell us about how you even started writing this book.
Yeah, so as Nada said, I'm a journalist. I got my start right out of college, which was in 2008 when there was an awful lot happening. And I ended up pivoting away from journalism and into policy, trying to find a role as a writer that, was interesting to me and would pay the bills with so many newspapers folding. And by sheer chance, I ended up in an office that was working on social innovation in public-private partnerships. So that was my introduction to the whole world of impact investing and using finance as a tool for social justice. In that role in particular, it was public dollars, but then later on in my career, I worked with foundations. I worked for a long time at the Urban Institute, which was doing similar public-private partnerships work around Pay for Success and other programs. And then the Global Steering Group for Impact Investment, which had more of a global lens on impact investing. And throughout all those experiences, what I kept coming back to was this conversation is really told in a way that's only going to resonate with a few people. Finance, unless you work in finance, the language used can be confusing, it can be exclusionary. Even if it's finance that is trying to do good, it's an inaccessible conversation. And I say that as, I'm an English major at heart, right? A lot of this was new to me. And I went to a small liberal arts college, and I would still find myself in finance conversations where I didn't know what we were talking about. So that was, and as someone in writing and communications, that was really important to me, that this be a conversation that didn't just happen in boardrooms with elite people. And so in 2019, two things happened. Last year, the before times, I started my own consulting firm, working on communications with a lot of these actors in the social sector to help them with exactly that, with democratizing the way that they told their story and the way that they engaged more people in impact investment. And then almost exactly 2 years ago at a conference in Amsterdam, I met Ben Roble, and we were at this conference. We tell the story a little bit in the book. And we'd actually met in passing before, but this was the first time we had like a proper conversation, as we were in this, great hall. It was in the former Amsterdam Stock Exchange, which dates back to the 1600s. The Queen of Norway was there for reasons. And sometimes the Queen just shows up, and there was these 5 people on stage talking about, how critically important it was to invest in women entrepreneurs in sub-Saharan Africa. And it was 3 white guys and 2 white women on stage, all from the US and Europe. We looked around the audience, including ourselves, and it was pretty much the same. And then afterwards, we went to an Amsterdam coffee shop, and we're like, this is a problem. It felt like, even though the speakers in that session at least were self-aware that we're talking about problems we've never experienced, but still the whole vibe of the event, we were like, there's a real disconnect here. There's a real disconnect, and there's something we can do about it. And I'll, give Ben's brief intro, because then that'll get it a little bit into the meat of the book. So Ben started his career at the NAACP. He worked in communications as a speechwriter. So both of us came from that world, and he was doing a lot of advocacy during the origins of the Black Lives Matter in Ferguson and Baltimore. He was working with NAACP leaders there, again, trying to help shape that conversation. And from there, he went to Village Capital, which I know we're going to talk more about and you're involved with. And they're an organization with a really unique mission. They run accelerator programs for impact-driven tech startups around the world. But the way that they invest in them is that each cohort that participates in one of these accelerator programs. They're all working on in the same sector and from the same region. So like FinTech in East Africa. At the end of their accelerator program, they decide which of their peers gets an investment from Village Capital's investment arm. And there have been a couple studies on their model, which to date shows that the returns they're getting are just as good as you would get doing it the old-fashioned way, but also that they have something like he would know these numbers better than I, but a lot more women and a lot more people of color are getting investment through this method when it's peer selected. So when we began the book, we were really stuck on this disconnect between people, the well-meaning white savior, and how do you solve problems without playing that role? What's a different way that we can shape this? And then are there other investors doing something similar to what Village Capital is doing? Because he knew they weren't the only ones in the space, but it's such a new emerging field. And then we said, let's write a book about it. We started writing, and then there was a pandemic. And we're like, well, now we have no choice but to write this book because we're locked in our homes for the next year and a half. So
I'm sure that accelerated the process a little bit.
yes, yeah.
Love it. So with all that being said, you mentioned a lot about access, creating access, a lot about the importance of understanding, or at least having lived experiences and understanding those lived experiences and applying them to whether it's building your own startup or for individuals who are investing in startups, to know that the people with the richest insights and are the ones that are closest to the top. So with that being said, what are some examples of the individuals you interviewed for the book?
We did almost 200 interviews for this book. And that actually was a funny upshot of the pandemic, that we were able, I think, to get on Zoom calls with people we might not otherwise have been able to interview because they were just used to being on Zoom all the time. And I think we talked to someone on every continent except Antarctica. So that was also, there's a lot of breadth there. We talked to a couple of venture capitalists. We talked to institutional investors who are interested in impact investing. We talked to a lot of activists across different issues, and who could point us to the funders that they thought were taking a better approach. And we found that a lot of it was a chain reaction, that we would speak to one person who would say, you should speak to these 10 other people, and you should speak to these 10 other people. So we were able to kind of follow those waves. We found several other organizations on the investing side that had interesting participatory models. And the book is about both philanthropy and impact investing. So we see them as sort of part of the same continuum. Edgar Villanueva, who was kind enough to write our foreword, he calls it the loans to gift spectrum. And so philanthropy being more on the gift side, and obviously investing more on the loan side. But yeah, we talked, sorry, my answer, yeah.
So you've spoken to individuals who are in the impact investing space, as well as traditional venture capitalists, or specifically impact investors?
With an impact bent.
Okay.
I mean, we also read all the research that I'm sure you have on, it's a lot of white guys from Stanford who like giving each other money. So we were looking, Ben had edited Ross Baird's book, The Innovation Blind Spot. So he had spoken for the research for that book with a number of venture capitalists who were experimenting with doing things differently. So that kind of got us started. We were focused on talking to people who were, if not already making change, then at least open to it. And I will say that pool of people expanded during the pandemic. I think there were a lot of things that were before and after for that, and that was one of them.
Are any of the models that you discovered of your favorites outside of Village Capital?
I was gonna say, Ben will kill me if I don't say Village Capital. Oh my God, they're so amazing. I mean, they really are great. There's also another peer selected, since he's not here, I can say there was another peer selected investment model that I really like called CEO, and they have a similar model there. They started in Canada in 2015. They have a US, UK, and I believe New Zealand. And it's a similar cohort program, and the finalists pick the winner who gets a zero interest loan from the group, and then it is to pay back within 5 years, and they have a 100% success rate. It's a really cool model. One that really fascinated us was the Boston Ujima Fund. I if anyone here is familiar with that. So this is a fund in these neighborhoods in South Boston that are now kind of being gentrified, historically low income or working class, historically Black and brown people. And with a lot of development in Boston and in cities like DC, it's driven by whatever the developer wants. And Ujima Fund, which was created in part by the leader of the Boston NAACP at the time, they created this investment fund. They raised this fund from different institutions around Boston. I think there were like Harvard students. There was a synagogue, I think, that gave some other, just do-gooder investors. And also from residents in the neighborhood who, because of the changes in some of the laws, could invest like $50, $100 in the fund. The catch was that the only people who could vote, who made up the investment committee, were residents of that neighborhood or people who identified as having been displaced from that neighborhood by gentrification. They were the only ones who could decide where the things were invested. And if you were the large institution or the super wealthy person who wasn't from there writing that large check, you accepted that. You accepted that the residents would be deciding. And also this, what they called an inverted capital stack. So normally when you put money into a loan and the loan starts making money, they pay back the person who, they pay back those who invested the most money because the logic is they took the most risk. The way Ujima thought about it is that a low-income person who invests $100 is actually taking a much greater risk than the super wealthy person who invests $50,000. So it's just thinking about risk in a different way. So they set up this fund to invest in businesses in the neighborhood, and they made their first investment right before the pandemic in a composting business that actually ended up doing really, really well during the pandemic because suddenly they were having to, that more people wanted to get into composting. The types of events around the city changed such that composting was more necessary. It's the first investment that they've made. So people have asked if there are other Ujimas. The answer is no, but they're still so new that I don't think that's going to be the same way for long. But they, they are buying for the residents of this neighborhood, and they're able to dictate, like, these are the types of employers that we want to see in our community. These are the services that we want. And the people who invested accepted that it was the residents who really knew what was going to make a difference.
I love everything about that.
Yeah.
And it sounds very similar to equity crowdfunding, which is incredibly popular now in the startup space. Do you have any experience there? And was anyone interviewed, for the book that has experience with that?
Yes, that was like Ben and I each had our rabbit holes that we loved falling down. Mine is equity crowdfunding, and he's not here, so y'all are going to hear everything I wanted. I wanted like a whole 2 chapters on equity crowdfunding, and I got half a chapter. So
Part 2.
Yeah, exactly. No, there were so equity crowdfunding. I think it's the model of the future especially for a lot of really early stage companies that are being built by people who don't come from family money, which right now, the people who are supposed, when you hear the stories about, the founders of Google started in their garage, it's like, yeah, but that garage was on the Stanford campus in Palo Alto. That's great, but that's not exactly there's a bit of a disconnect there. We spoke with WeFunder about their model and the regulatory changes that were necessary to allow for non-accredited investors to make those $100 investments. And the thing that got me is that those old laws dated back to the Depression, when Congress decided that what really caused the Depression was poor people getting scammed. So in order to invest, you needed to be accredited because otherwise you were going to get scammed. And anyone who's watched Succession can tell you, you can get scammed no matter how rich or poor you are. Scamming. And so it's nice to see that the legal change that finally recognized that. And so being able to raise early stage and equity crowdfunding, I think is going to be essential. The sector that we highlighted in the book, and this was something that I had been researching independently and then realized we could bring into the book, was the cannabis industry. So marijuana is legal in DC now, and it's legal in, I think, 13 states now, so, give or take. But because marijuana is still illegal at the federal level, if you're trying to start a marijuana business, the bank that holds your money, like Bank of America and like the national banks, they can't / won't / pretty much can't be your bank. You have to go to either a local credit union that's willing to take that risk of operating because they're only with state laws. It's really difficult to raise money, which is why, and on top of that, you have the the way that communities of color bore the brunt of incarceration as a result of punitive marijuana laws, and yet you kind of need to already have money if you're going to build a cannabis business because access to capital is so restricted. So we talked about Fundana, which is an equity crowdfunding platform that is specifically for marijuana-related startups in states where it's legal, and they actually the first Massachusetts, where I grew up, they gave. It's the second Black cannabis entrepreneur in the country, and the first one in the state. He used Fundana to raise his seed round. And so as more and more states legalize, hopefully there'll be a change at the federal level, but as more states legalize, it's merged. It's not just a tool to use if you need a seed round period. It's also for this industry where the regulation just is so patchwork and doesn't make a ton of sense. It's a way to kind of circumvent that and get capital in a way that's legal and in a way that doesn't privilege only people who already have money.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I see it as being a game changer in the space for sure, because it both empowers entrepreneurs who are historically underfunded and we'll say over-mentored, right?
Yes,
so
I heard that a lot.
yes. Like an example we could give is Black women being one of the fastest growing groups of entrepreneurs, but least likely to receive funding. They're both small businesses and venture capital. Right, but through equity crowdfunding, WeFunder, Republic, there are various platforms out there. Big fan of Arlen Hamilton. Backstage Capital, her firm, which she raised while she was homeless. Look up her story. It's a different.
She's amazing. You should all read her book.
So you have these founders who are able to raise the funding from the people, as opposed to having to rely on venture capitalists who are historically the gatekeepers. So with all that being said, I think we have some time here for questions, if we can open it up to have some more people participate in the conversation.
Great. I'd love to kick it off if that's okay. I'm just gonna take the privilege of step back and I'm still seated up here. But I think speaking of and thinking about, the nature of the network that we have with members here and so on, I think, one of the things that really caught my eye flipping through the book is the afterword, with kind of trying to extrapolate some lessons about participatory, grant making and philanthropy and impact investing. But what can that help us? What can that teach us about coming back to the public sector, right? So we've alluded to open budgets and citizen budgets where people can have a say on how public funds are spent, especially at the local government level. But would love to hear you, speak more to that really interesting connection, since I think it's relevant to a lot of us in this room too.
Sure. So in the early draft of the book, actually, we had a whole section on tech, just on tech, and then we ended up focusing more on philanthropy and impact investing as sources of funding. But it's something, it was originally the core of the book, and the afterword. So we wrote an afterword right after the insurrection about participation and democracy, which ended up looking at different ways of strengthening, rebuilding trust in democratic institutions and engaging with government beyond just voting every 2 or every 4 years, but on a day-to-day basis, what's that look like and how can we make it easier? Because the breakdown of trust with institutions, with each other, we saw is pretty fundamental to a lot of the scary stuff that's happening now. And especially, we had a different afterword written and we just scrapped it on January 7th. It was obviously, if you were here then, it was traumatizing and horrible. And, it's also something that I think a lot of us unfortunately saw coming. So participatory budgeting is the first one that we get into, and that's been that model originated in Brazil in the 1980s. There's a line in the budget usually for a city or municipality, and the citizens get to vote on how that money is spent. So it's not just we elect a budget director. No, it's direct vote by the citizens on how that money is spent. And the Brazil example, the decisions that they made ended up reducing child mortality by 20% over the next several years. There was a positive correlation with some of the decisions they made. And that model has now been used all over the world. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it's an idea that's really hot steam. There's actually a woman running for mayor of Buffalo on a participatory budgeting platform right now. I heard her on a podcast earlier this week and I got really excited. We also talk about policy juries, which are exactly what they sound like. It's you get called for jury duty as a citizen, but instead of deciding a criminal case, you're asked to hear experts talk about different policy issues. And experts include academics as well as those with lived experience, and then vote on whether, should there be a referendum on this question, yes or no. The example that we give actually was abortion in Ireland, which, as you can imagine, would be a very sensitive issue. They convened a policy jury and they listened to experts, including some from the Catholic Church, including people with lived experience from abortion, ethicists who fell on various parts of the spectrum, and they voted for there to be a referendum in Ireland. And Ireland surprisingly legalized abortion. This was about 3 or 4 years ago. And then we end by talking about theater of the oppressed in New York City, which was a way that also originated in Brazil. We talked specifically about the New York one because it was, there was a New York City cop who credited a performance he saw with changing his mind on some of the stop and frisk laws in the city. It's when people, you're sitting in the audience and there are actors on stage and they're acting out real experiences that they've had, and the audience gets involved. It's a little hard to explain, but it basically invites you. It's I'd probably explain it better in the book, but basically it's a form of theater that actually gets everyone engaged, and the goal is to think about, like, what would I do if I was in this person's shoes? And yeah, this New York City cop went, and it was a trans woman who was recounting her experience being treated horribly when she was being arrested, and the cop got some of this laws in the city changed because of that experience, which is, a great outcome. I realize I got a little bit away from technology there, but.
Good, and I also wanted to actually check in too, and just quick acknowledgement too to the whole team who helped organize this, excluding Embika, who was really instrumental to bring us all together. Do you want to step in also and just kind of help with some of the moderation?
Yeah. So one of the questions I had, and I think Gary and Bianca can speak a little bit more about this. But when Village Capital just recently started their program, it's a program that I've been doing some freelance video and writing work around. So they've supported 13 entrepreneur support organizations that are Black and Brown founded in the US. And when they decided to go in to support these organizations, they actually paired up with Black Innovation Alliance, which is the place that Bianca works. And Gary is one of the ESOs that have received the funding. And so I'm curious, like, when people who are not of a community decided they're going to go into community to come in to do stuff, I think it was really smart that Village Capital did pair up with someone else. And I'm curious, what models like that you feel work, and how does that work? Do people just Google hey, organizations are culturally competent, let's go find a friend, and then we'll go into the community with this friend? And I'm just curious, also as someone who's received the funding, did it feel strange to see Village Capital with Black Innovation Alliance funding, or did it feel natural? I'm curious from all three perspectives.
Yeah, no, as a beneficiary, I am incredibly grateful. So when I saw the combination and the invitation to be a part of it, it was like a godsend, honestly. Because as somebody who's building up an entrepreneur support organization in an environment that doesn't necessarily value that work, to have an external, two external organizations come in and say, hey, we love what you're doing, we want to support this, amplify it, and connect you with foundations literally around the world. It was amazing. So I would actually ask Bianca her experience, because talking about lived experience and being on the ground, pulling it together, Bianca's one of the people to thank for that. So
thanks y'all for putting me on the spot. Hi everyone, my name is Bianca St. Louis. My last name is actually St. Louis. So I think this is just me with my general hat on. I think I really appreciated kind of the collaboration, because it was just that, a collaboration. I think this was actually one of the questions I was going to ask you, because I think a lot of times folks think that including folks with lived experiences means that like, all right, great, I'll leave the room now, you know, like versus we shouldn't be afraid to collaborate. I think power needs to learn collaboration, right? Power, influence, I think, yes, there's a cultural competency aspect, but I also think there's the privilege competency too, right? I think there are ways in which folks can kind of bring their understanding of the systems, how you maneuver in the system. So I think to me, this was a great opportunity for a genuine partnership. Like we are like very intentional about like leveraging each of our unique capacities. And the fun fact, you know, Black and brown folks are not only great at cultural competency, they can do a lot of other things aside from tell you this is how it feels to be Black and brown. So I think even just reminding self that like there are other capacity items that organizations can bring, and there are other ways in which they can kind of support the work. And I think again, it's like, how do we build a shared world? How do we build shared impact? How like, I think that kind of is often very lost. So yeah, I think maybe as I think about like collaboration, partnership, and maybe to answer your question about like, how do you find these things? I really think it is often pretty organic. I think like Dustin and Kelly met each other at like a social innovation summit or something, right? They were like, hey, you're doing great work. We're doing great work. Let's talk about this great, you know, like let's cook something up. And I think it's important for both sides to kind of know their strengths, know what they bring to the table. But I think maybe that's what I would say to that. But that did kind of go into one of the questions I was kind of wondering about is, you know, I think a lot of times it feels very all or nothing. You know, when folks are like, we want to give the platform to others, but like, I don't want a platform that's not supported, you know,
Right.
like, and I think a lot of times folks are like, great, if I'm not leading it, I'm not resourcing it. So I guess maybe what were kind of some of the perspectives that you were, you know, getting from the book or with folks around like the nuances that they felt there?
Yeah, that's a great question. And thank you for sharing all that. I really appreciate that. And what I interviewed Kelly a couple months ago for an article, and she's amazing. So one thing that we ran into when we spoke with investors and with philanthropists is that we talk about this idea of participation and value and lived experience, and no one disagreed with us. But then when you push them on it a little bit, it was like, oh, well, you know, but what if they don't know how this works or that works? Like, we can't possibly do that. It was this very interesting disconnect that, like, in theory, they agreed with it. In practice, they weren't sure what that meant. And we, there's a framework in social science called the ladder of participation. I don't know if anyone, yeah, if you're familiar with it. It was developed in the 60s. There's a whole rabbit hole of history there that I won't get into, but basically it looks at measures of participation. There's the bottom rung is non-participation, which is like there is just a one way. I am telling you X, if you don't even get to respond, or if you do, I don't care. Then there's tokenism, which is like, well, you're asked for input or feedback, which is great, but there's no guarantee that that's actually going to inform any decisions that are being made. We talked to a number of people off the record who've been in situations where they were told, oh, run this town hall so that people think their opinions are being heard, but actually we already know what we're going to do anyway. And then you have the highest rung, which is power, which is where there's like a shared responsibility, as you said, like you don't, there's when those investors or funders freak out, it's because they think if it's going from 0 to 60, and it's like, well, no, you bring different things to the table. A lot of the examples that we cite in the book are like the investment committee is like 50% of people with like, you know, the kind of Wall Street experience, it's 50% people with lived experience, and some who have both. It's not having only one kind of voice in the room that matters most. And it actually, and your point about well, just reminded me that one of the Ujima folks told us about a story where a Harvard student who came from a lot of money had invested in Ujima and was like, well, I really want to do more than just invest. And they were like, great, you can be on this committee. And he was like, okay, and showed up and was like, all right, I am leading this committee. Here's what we're going to do, because like he's a white guy at Harvard. And he's like, he genuinely thinks that this is like what is expected of him, is that he is in charge of this committee. And I wasn't in this room, although I really wish I was, but they were like, okay, sit down, young man. Like this is not, and you know, you can be part of this, but you're not automatically in charge. And to this guy's credit, he like took that and was like, okay, I will just be on this committee. And he learned, you know, because he did have ideas. He did have some really good ideas. He I forget what the committee was for, so I can't be specific about it, but I do remember that it turned out he was like also an Excel wizard. So he was like really helping them with all their finances, which no one on that committee knew how to do. And you know, there you go, he had a role. But it was that idea that like he walked in thinking he would be in charge. And that's, I think, what you have to avoid when you're in a position of power, saying, okay, I really want to help here. Walk in the room, first thing you're going to do is listen, and then you're going to contribute. You're not going to walk in and say, all right, I have all my blueprints here, and you do this, you do this, you do this. So
No, yeah, I think when you said that, it just made me think about like, I think a lot of times people equate power to superiority.
yeah,
And they look at everything or everyone as like, you know, just because you're not powerful doesn't mean that, you know, you don't know what you're doing. Power can be acquired a lot of different ways. So I think I definitely appreciated that perspective, but I think even the sense of like, I think a lot of times folks think that the best positioning or role for them is to be leading, right? And yeah, and I think that can kind of, you know, cause a lot of shakeups. So thank you for sharing the perspective and the notes.
So I feel like I successfully put her on the spot, and so I just want to do the same for Gary real quick. So I do want to just say that Gary started First Founders I think a year and a half ago, and on his second or third cohort, because they were in the pandemic, they actually asked for applicants, and 120 people applied, and he decided to actually accept all 120 people, and decided to create like a Slack network, and decided to just be inclusive. And some of those were based in Africa. And so one of the things that he actually did was did a pitch competition and stuff on Twitter. And so what I just think is really innovative about some of the work that people are doing is actually not only just being inclusive, but not like making inclusivity feel like a click, you know. And I really appreciate that, you know, because I feel like that happens a lot now, where like social justice movements become very cliquish, and like you have to be a certain way to be accepted in that. And I just thought that one of the things I really valued about the way that you've been approaching your stuff is that it's been inclusive in the entirety of that word.
Well, thank you. No, I appreciate it. But yeah, I love everything about all of this work, just building more inclusive ecosystems. I think that's what it's all about. And thank goodness for, well, we can use tech for good and we can use it for bad. I would prefer to use it for good. I'll say that,
sure.
You know.
Bold stance to take.
Yes, but no, it can be used in some really, really great ways. Like we did our pitch competition on, through our podcast, actually. So through the podcast, each founder in our community had their own episode. And the way that they got votes, similar to Village Capital, where the community decides on who wins the funding, the founders had their own episode, had to get as many listens as they could to make it to the final. So that was one way. And we did a demo day on Twitter, and that was super cool. And there's a bunch of VCs and whatnot and entrepreneurs already on there. So just tapping into that space. So more of that to come. But yeah, more questions.
I think there's a question.
Yes, there's a question
please.
online from Michael Jarvis, who is part of the Hub community from Transparency and Accountability Initiative. And Michael, you can ask it live. Look at that.
Damn.
I hope you can hear me.
Oh,
Yes, it's getting really hyper.
I know.
Thanks so much. And so yeah, I work with a funder collaborative. So we've got 7 funders, mostly US-based private foundations. So I'd love, Meg, to hear a little bit about what you heard from major foundations about letting go, particularly anything that went beyond just niche projects, and what pushback you heard, because most of the examples we've been able to document, and we got a live discussion amongst our members about how to be more participatory right now, but the most successful ones tend to be smaller funds that were set up from the very beginning with this sort of participation built in. And for the more long-standing foundations, it's more painful to to sort of try and transition. So would love to hear a little bit more about that angle to it. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. So we spoke to a number of foundations, including some of the smaller funds that you're talking about, where they were pretty much started for that purpose. But we also spoke to some larger funds that fully transitioned, and then major ones like MacArthur, like the MacArthur Foundation, that have piloted a participatory process for different grant programs. And for large institutions, it usually does start with a pilot or with what we call in the book regranting. Ford Foundation is a major donor to a lot of participatory funds that were built for that purpose, even though their internal process isn't participatory. So that's where we see some of the, that's where we've seen the institutions kind of dip their toe in. Mama Cash in Amsterdam, they were the ones they underwent a 3-year process to transition to a participatory grant making model that they just finished in January, which was nicely timed for the release of our book. And they don't nearly the endowment of MacArthur, but they were an organization that changed their structure for that purpose. And this reminds me of something I meant to bring up in response to Bianca's question, which is that as part of Mama Cash's transition, they were retraining their staff to be facilitating the process that would now fall to these community members. So they were offering that training, and they were also compensating members of the community for their time to be part of the process, which is a huge thing, especially when you're dealing with lower income communities. Like, you are paying people for their expertise. It's like any other transaction. You have to, you need to show that value and show that you mean it. The Heron Foundation is another really interesting case. They do some participatory grant making, but they announced in 2020 that they would be turning over 100% of their endowment to community control for the communities that they served. And they were and they still are very transparent about, we're building the plane as we're flying it. And they're in regular contact with those communities to figure out, okay, so what sort of training, what's the expertise that Heron brings that can help them? What are they looking for out of that management process? And so because they're a year and a half in at this point, it's not totally clear what it's going to look like, but the sort of commitment to that transparency and the fact that they basically went to the communities and said, look, if you guys want to do this, like, we'll do this with you, and hold hands and jump. So there was definitely a lot more willingness by larger institutions to consider it. Yes, it's a slower process, but we were really excited by what we were seeing, and especially how things got accelerated during the pandemic.
Thanks so much for the conversation. I love that you opened your book with this conference in Amsterdam. I lived there for the last 5 years. So the Burst Van Berlage, that building, this experience, it's so common. Actually, to describe it as tone deaf would be the only way. My question to you is, it sounds as if this conversation is a lot about smaller impact investors with a lot of, frankly, flexibility. If you look at where a lot of the capital is moving, a lot of it does come from larger development finance institutions, multilateral development banks, who are often and rightfully criticized for not being participatory or transparent enough. My question to you is, what do you recommend to such larger institutions on how they can be more accessible?
That is a really good question. And I have an answer. My caveat is just that we very intentionally did not talk about DFIs in this book, because we felt like we would be writing the entire book about DFIs, because there's some nuances there. With that being said, my advice would be similar to what I would tell people at the staff of large institutions, which is like, identify a way that you can pilot something different, and in a way that won't, I know that when you're receiving public funding, a lot of the concern is, it's very clear rules written by Congress or whatever bodies are governing you, and no one wants to get held before Congress. So, but if there's, when there's like innovation money or other types of capital where there's room to breathe there, it's pushing for that experimentation. And then there's also the kind of, not off the books experimentation, but like, are there ways to sort of informally involve the communities more in the way that you're working at the grant, on the ground. I think that's also really important. But yeah, that is, I mean, that's a huge world, and you're raising issues that are really significant there.
Hi. The same performative, I'm Jed, the same performative kind of listening that Bianca was alluding to. Like, oh, we're so glad you're here to give the perspective of who we think you are based on how you look, or can happen at the institutional level, where an entire initiative like this, like a participatory budget or whatever, can be brought into the room just so that everybody can feel like, oh, look, we're innovative. So the more I think about what you're talking about, and I apologize for this, the more there's a campaign orientation to it, right? This is organizing, right?
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how to avoid getting invited. This is similar to the gentleman's question, like how to avoid getting kind of co-opted into, oh, we love what you're doing, now go home 2 years later, or stay in the innovation box.
Yeah, this came up a lot with folks that we interviewed who had been doing this work for a long time, that they didn't want to be co-opted or have it be like oh, that's like our one stream of innovation funding runs like this, and the rest of us don't. And I mean, that is where the campaign mindset comes in, because if you're truly doing it right, and even if it's just one program, then it should be kind of changing your mindset about the other programs. And how quickly that mindset shift happens depends on a lot of different factors, where everyone's head's at to begin with, the relative success of that one program. I know, like, there's a lot of factors at play, and so the key is persistence. And the mantra for the book was really, the process is the point. Like, the more that you're engaging, the more that you're pushing things in a different direction, the more that you're letting learnings from doing things differently inform your other work. Like, that it's an ongoing conversation. And it's why, like, with all the participatory funders that we talk to, like, they're constantly tweaking how they engage with communities and how communities engage with them, because things change. But there's a fundamental trust there of like, all right, well, this isn't quite working, let's try it like this. And so, which goes back to the trust building that we talk about in the afterward, which is like, there's a lot of ways to build trust. It usually takes a while, and there's no quick and dirty answer, but it's like it's saying like, yes, this is great, now let's keep going. It's maintaining that mindset and continuing that push, not stopping and saying, well, great, we did the thing.
I'll just take a moment for a quick time check. We're at 5:30. You are welcome to continue this conversation in just a few minutes after I give everyone a chance to wrap up. And by the way, I'm Isabella, program manager here, and I'm going to be playing your host on the terrace soon in just a few minutes.
I guess it would be good to know, are there any final questions online before we wrap things up?
Not that I know from Veronica. Veronica,
I did have a question. Don't want to stand between y'all and your happy hour. I guess, were there any, because I think you probably went in there, had your point of view, had your perspectives, but was there anything that kind of changed your perspective along your journey? Kind of any like new ideas that you're like, not really, I didn't really consider this, or were there any spaces that you developed a deeper space of empathy for maybe another kind of point of view? I'd love to kind of hear. Or not really.
No, I'm trying to, like, I don't know if I can pick one. Like, it was the whole process was really transformative. I mean, Ben and I had no idea what we were getting into when we started. And we very quickly realized that, and very quickly we're like, we need to be in listening mode. Throughout the whole process, as our knowledge deepened, we were also conscious of like, we're two white people writing this book. How do we, like, yes, we've gathered all this, but like, how do we do this without centering ourselves? And we're still having that conversation as we promote it. Like, it's tricky. I think the example that I'll give, and this happened, so just before the pandemic, we flew to Boston for interviews with Ujima Fund. This is like February 2020. So like, right, it was the only reporting trip we ended up being able to do. And I grew up just outside Boston, and I had never, and when I was growing up, I went to, it was the town I grew up in was 95% white. My high school, same thing. The American history we learned was very, very focused on, you know, the Revolutionary War and, you know, pushing back on the British and slavery. That's the thing the South did. Like, it was a very narrow presentation of history that I just didn't question. And part of when we were there, they had a big display in the Ujima Fund headquarters about some of the history of redlining in and around Boston. And I spent, I think, an hour and a half with the guy who curated that. And that really that was incredibly powerful for me because, you know, now being in my 30s, and having, you know, unlearned and relearned a lot of history. Like, I knew that what I had been taught growing up was really whitewashed, but just kind of seeing just how bad, like, the area in the town I grew up in, where the red lines were, like, that was where the one affordable housing building in the synagogue were. That was in the area that had been redlined up until the 1930s. And that was just kind of like, my stomach dropped. And I was like, I hadn't even thought about it. And I was like, why didn't I ever think about it? You know, you get into your own privilege, but I was really grateful that I had that wake up call, and it made writing about this amazing fund in Boston that much more powerful. There was also, for me, I'm getting a little emotional, sorry, but it was like, being able to tell that story was my way of being like, I'm so sorry that I didn't see this sooner. Like, what happened was really that there was so much messed up stuff going on for so long, and still is. And so that really, of all the things, I think that might have been the biggest. Like, I just had my eyes opened in a way that I didn't expect to.
So Meg, I think maybe the last question is, where do we get your book? Where do we find Letting Go? How do we follow you? How do we follow?
Yes. So I was supposed to bring a box of books here to sell to you, and in the chaos of realizing Ben was sick, that didn't happen, so I apologize. You can buy the book, the hardcover, online at lettinggobook.org. It's also for sale at Potter's House Books in Adams Morgan, and also Lost City Books in Adams Morgan, those two local bookstores, if you want to support them. If you have an e-reader, it is available on Amazon Kindle if you just search for it. We're really trying to, there's a lot of books named Letting Go, and almost all of them appear to be written by cult leaders, so. Something we should have probably. The top result for Letting Go, I'm pretty sure it's a cult leader. I'm just saying, but like, we're there. If you search for what Ben's or my name, you'll find it. And
we do already have a copy. This is the Open GovHub library copy that I got the first pass at when Ben came by a couple months back. Yeah. So there's also a copy here for those of you who are members here. So.
Yeah, and the link is in the chat for those of you online, and we also linked it in the original invitation to the event, so you can grab it there.
Thank you. And anywhere we can follow you online as well?
yes, so I'm at Ms. Meg Massey, and MS Meg Massey, and then Ben is at Ben Rubel. We're both pretty active on Twitter and on LinkedIn. And you can also follow on Instagram at Letting Go Book. We have some fun, like that. You see that for make a few more appearances.
It's a very nice bird.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Meg.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you to Open GovHub. This was awesome. Thank you, everybody, for coming out.
Yeah, thank you. And folks on the Zoom, so like this is a great taste for our hybrid future together. But just real quick, I'd love to close us out with just a couple quick takeaways. We like to try to end Open GovHub events with 2 or 3 kind of takeaways. We can't capture all the richness of the discussion, but a couple of quick points that stood out. I heard about lots of innovative tools to think about more participatory decision making, from the inverted capital stack example to the policy juries, and lots of other tools that are available at our disposal. So I hope we can all think about making use of those. And also just thinking about how to encourage big, massive institutions, to start with a pilot, and how that can help push culture change over time. And then finally, to be aware and wary of tokenism and co-opting happening both with inclusion efforts and with innovation efforts, and to do what we can to really make sure that those are meaningful and not just checkbox activities. So really appreciate everyone joining us again for today's discussion. Those of you in the room, yes, please join us now to the outdoor terrace for happy hour. And those online, thank you again for listening in, and yeah, hope everyone has a great evening. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Online.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.